The facility hummed with the particular frequency that indicated third shift, when most research personnel surrendered to their circadian protocols and left the observation decks empty. Caelthra preferred these hours. The silence allowed her to focus on the data without the interference of colleagues who still harbored inefficient emotional responses to their work. She stood before the transparent wall of Observation Cell 7, stylus poised above her data tablet, watching the newest subject complete his 14th hour of enforced wakefulness. The human sat cross-legged on the floor, spine straight despite the muscle fatigue readings that spiked across her secondary monitor. His eyes remained open, tracking something she could not see, perhaps counting the rhythm of his own breathing. 7 orbital cycles. That was how long Caelthra had been perfecting her methodology, documenting the precise parameters at which different species transitioned from resistance to collapse. The Velkari broke quickly, their communal psychology unable to withstand isolation. The Thresh lasted longer, their redundant nervous systems providing temporary resilience, but even they eventually succumbed when she introduced the correct combination of sensory deprivation and metabolic stress. The human had been in containment for 6 planetary rotations. He should have begun showing deterioration by the 3rd. Caelthra adjusted the atmospheric controls, lowering the temperature another 2 degrees, standard protocol when baseline methods proved insufficient. She watched his body register the change, saw the subtle shift in his posture as he conserved heat, drawing his limbs closer to his core. No panic, no distress vocalizations, just adaptation. Her fingers traced the edge of the data tablet, a habit she had developed during the previous year when the precision of her work had earned recognition from the Strategic Research Directorate. They had questions about human resilience, about the limits of this species that had expanded so aggressively through contested space. The questions came with substantial funding and no oversight regarding methods. Caelthra had never questioned the ethics of her research. Her species valued knowledge above comfort, progress above sentiment. The subjects were prisoners, casualties of conflicts she had no hand in creating. Their suffering served a purpose larger than individual experience. She told herself this during every shift. It had always been sufficient justification. The human's head turned, and for a moment his gaze seemed to focus directly on the observation wall. Impossible, of course. The one-way transparency was absolute. Yet Caelthra found herself stepping back, her secondary heart rate accelerating in a way that suggested her autonomic system had detected a threat her conscious mind had not yet processed. He returned his attention to his breathing exercises. Caelthra returned to her data, noting the temperature adjustment and setting a timer for the next observation interval. The third shift silence pressed against the facility's walls. Somewhere in the research wing, automated systems cycled air and nutrients. Somewhere in the containment sector, 42 other subjects endured their own calibrated suffering. Caelthra had stopped learning their names after the first orbital cycle. Numbers proved more efficient, less prone to the cognitive errors that emotional attachment generated. Subject 7 Alpha, human, male, approximate age 30 standard years, prisoner exchange from the Epsilon Corridor conflict. No family notifications on file, no formal protests regarding his detention, no one who would ask where he had gone or what was being done to him. Caelthra added another notation to her log, documenting the absence of expected behavioral markers. The data would need to be analyzed, patterns identified, new hypotheses tested. The human's resilience represented either an anomaly or an oversight in her methodology. Either possibility demanded investigation. She stayed at the observation wall longer than protocol required, watching the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the minimal movements that suggested consciousness fighting against exhaustion. Her own reflection ghosted across the transparent surface, pale features and dark eyes that her species associated with intellectual rigor, overlapping with the human's contained stillness. The facility's atmospheric systems shifted to night cycle parameters. Caelthra finally turned away, her footsteps echoing against metal floors as she walked toward her personal quarters. Behind her, the observation monitors continued their vigilant recording, capturing every heartbeat, every breath, every moment of a suffering that was supposed to serve some greater understanding. She did not look back. The human developed routines. Kael'thra noticed it during the second week of observation. When the lights dimmed to simulate night cycles, he performed a specific sequence of stretches, moving through positions that required balance and control, despite the weakness that should have rendered such movements impossible. When she restricted his food rations, he divided each portion into precise thirds, consuming them at intervals that maximized metabolic efficiency. During isolation periods, he talked to himself. Kael'thra activated the audio sensors, listening to the low murmur of his voice as he recited what her translation algorithms identified as poetry, mathematical sequences, fragments of songs. Not madness, not the deterioration she had documented in other subjects, something closer to deliberate preservation, as if he were maintaining the architecture of his mind through intentional use. She increased the sensory deprivation protocols, complete darkness for 12-hour intervals. White noise designed to prevent restful sleep, temperature fluctuations that kept his body in constant metabolic stress. The human adapted to each change. On the 19th day, Kael'thra entered the observation deck to find her supervisor waiting. Velkorn stood with the particular stillness of their species, secondary arms folded across his thorax, primary eyes fixed on the monitor displaying Subject 7 Alpha's vital statistics. "Your human is not responding to standard protocols," Velkorn observed, his translator rendering the clicking consonants of their shared language into flat declarative statements. Kael'thra moved to her workstation, pulling up the accumulated data. The responses are present, but delayed. Human neurological architecture appears to prioritize psychological resilience over immediate physical comfort. The Strategic Directorate requires actionable intelligence, not observations about architectural priorities. Velkorn's attention shifted to her, three eyes tracking her movements with the precision their species employed during formal evaluations. "Escalate your methodology." The directive was clear. Kael'thra felt something tighten in her thoracic cavity, a physical sensation she could not immediately categorize. "I am following established research protocols." "Then establish new ones." Velkorn moved toward the exit, pausing at the threshold. "We need to understand their breaking point before they understand ours." After he left, Kael'thra stood in the empty observation deck, her reflection merging with the human's image on the transparent wall. He was performing his evening exercises, movements slow but controlled, counting repetitions in that same steady voice he used during isolation periods. She pulled up the containment protocols, scrolling through options she had not yet implemented. Sleep deprivation beyond 72 hours, nutrient restriction sufficient to induce ketosis, social isolation extending into months. Her fingers hesitated over the authorization commands. The human completed his exercises and sat down, spine straight, beginning the breathing pattern he used before sleep. Kael'thra watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way he seemed to compress himself against exhaustion through nothing but will. She thought about Velkorn's directive, about the Strategic Directorate's impatience, about the purpose her research was supposed to serve. She authorized the next escalation protocol and left the observation deck before she could witness its implementation. The protocols required direct biometric sampling by the 4th week. Kael'thra had delayed the procedure as long as professionally justifiable, but the data-demanded touch required her to enter the containment space and make physical contact with the subject. She prepared herself according to standard procedures. Protective membrane gloves, sterile collection implements, a rehearsed script of clinical instructions. The door to Observation Cell 7 unsealed with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Kael'thra stepped into the space she had only observed from a distance. The human did not stand. He remained seated on the floor, watching her approach with an expression she still could not fully interpret, not hostility, not submission. Something more complex, as if he were studying her with the same clinical attention she had applied to him. "I need to collect tissue samples," Kael'thra said, her translator converting her native language into approximated human phonemes. "Extended your arm." He complied slowly, movements economical in a way that suggested careful management of limited energy. His forearm came to rest on his knee, palm up, skin marked with the subtle signs of controlled deprivation. Dry patches. Visible veins. The faint tremor of muscles pushed beyond sustainable limits. Kael'thra knelt beside him, maintaining the professional distance her training demanded. She pressed the scanner to his inner wrist, and the warmth of his skin registered through the protective membrane in a way that made her secondary heart skip. Humans ran hot. The xenobiological literature had documented this, explained it as a consequence of their inefficient metabolic processes. But reading about temperature differentials was not the same as feeling it, experiencing the way heat radiated from his body and seemed to seek the cooler surface of her gloved fingers. "You're afraid," the human said quietly. Kyle-Thra's attention snapped to his face. "I am conducting research protocols. Fear is not a relevant variable." "Not of me." His gaze held steady, direct in a way that made her want to look away. "Of what you're doing." The scanner completed its cycle, emitting a soft tone. Kyle-Thra should have withdrawn her hand, proceeded to the next measurement. Instead, she found herself hyper-aware of the point of contact, the way his pulse beat against her fingers, too slow for the stress his body displayed. "I am documenting behavioral responses to controlled environmental stress," she said, hearing the defensive edge in her own voice. "The methodology is sound." "Is it?" He did not move, did not pull away from her touch. "Or are you just following orders from people who will never have to see what their questions cost?" Kyle-Thra removed her hand, the warmth lingering on her palm despite the protective barrier. She stood, creating distance, retreating to the clinical neutrality that had always protected her from these moments. "Your personal opinions are not part of the research parameters." "No," he agreed. "But they're part of what makes me human." She left the containment cell without collecting the remaining samples, her hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with temperature regulation. The human's words followed Kyle-Thra into her quarters, into the silence of her sleep cycles, into the space between professional duty and something she had no vocabulary to name. She pulled his file during off hours, reading details she had previously dismissed as irrelevant to the research. Name Marcus Chen. Enlisted service in Human Defensive Forces. Captured during evacuation operations in the Epsilon Corridor. Decorated for extracting civilian populations from hostile zones. Not a soldier, a rescuer. Kyle-Thra closed the file, but the information remained, refusing to compress back into the comfortable abstraction of Subject 7 Alpha. She thought about his steady pulse, about the way he counted breaths instead of begging, about the deliberate preservation of his mind through poetry and mathematics, about the question he had asked her, "Are you just following orders?" Her species valued hierarchy, trusted that those in authority made decisions for the collective good. Kyle-Thra had built her entire career on this foundation, had never questioned the purpose behind her research, because questioning implied doubt, and doubt implied weakness. She returned to the observation deck during third shift, standing before the transparent wall as Marcus performed his evening routine. He moved more slowly now, the accumulated stress finally manifesting in his physical capability. But he did not stop, did not surrender to the exhaustion that should have claimed him. Kyle-Thra activated the atmospheric controls, her fingers hovering over the temperature adjustment. Standard protocol dictated another reduction. The data demanded escalation. She deactivated the control panel without making changes. Instead, she watched Marcus complete his exercises, watched him settle into his breathing pattern, watched the way he seemed to gather himself against the suffering she administered with such clinical precision. The facility's night cycle hum filled the silence. Kyle-Thra's reflection stared back at her from the transparent wall, pale and contained and utterly alone. She had dedicated 7 orbital cycles to understanding the mechanics of collapse, had documented the precise point where resilience gave way to breaking. But she had never asked why breaking mattered, had never questioned what her careful measurements were actually for. Marcus's eyes opened, and though he could not see her, could not know she stood watching in the darkness beyond his cell, Kyle-Thra felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical visibility. She left the observation deck and walked through corridors that smelled of recycled air and antiseptic, past other cells containing other subjects enduring their own calibrated suffering. The facility's systems hummed their indifferent song, and Kyle-Thra felt the weight of every choice she had made to arrive at this moment, this recognition that her work had cost more than she had ever allowed herself to calculate. Kyle-Thra began making small adjustments to Marcus's containment protocols. She told herself it was experimental variation, a different methodological approach to test alternative hypotheses. She increased his food rations by 12%, calibrated to appear as random fluctuation rather than intentional modification. She reduced the frequency of isolation periods. She stabilized the temperature at a level that no longer required constant metabolic compensation. The changes were subtle enough to escape administrative notice, but significant enough that she could track their effects. Marcus's physical markers improved incrementally. The tremors in his hands decreased. His sleep cycles showed fewer interruptions. His voice during the periods when he spoke to himself carried less roughness, more resonance. Caelthra documented everything, creating parallel data streams, one for official reporting, one for her private analysis. The official reports emphasized continued research into human resilience patterns. The private logs tracked something else entirely, the specific ways a person recovered when suffering decreased, when someone chose to inflict less harm. She found herself entering the containment cell more frequently, ostensibly for biometric monitoring that required proximity. The professional justification remained valid, but Caelthra knew her motivations had shifted into territory her training had never addressed. During the 6th week, she knelt beside Marcus to collect blood samples, and he spoke without being prompted. "You changed something," he said, watching her prepare the collection stylus. "About 10 days ago." Caelthra's hands stilled. "All variables remain within research parameters. I didn't say you made it easier. Just different." His gaze tracked her movements with that same complex awareness. "Why?" She pressed the stylus to his inner elbow, watching his blood fill the collection chamber with the particular red that human biology produced. The warmth of his skin registered through her gloves, familiar now in a way that unsettled her. "Experimental methodology requires variation," she said, the practiced response coming automatically. "That's not an answer." Caelthra removed the stylus, applying a sealant to the puncture site. Her fingers lingered on his arm longer than necessary, feeling the steady pulse beneath his skin, the heat that her species could never generate. "I am attempting to understand what strength actually means," she said quietly, not looking at his face. "Your definition, not mine." Marcus was silent for several heartbeats. When Caelthra finally met his eyes, she saw something shift in his expression. Not softening exactly, but a recognition that seemed to bypass language entirely. "It means choosing what matters when everything else is noise," he said. "It means protecting something beyond yourself even when you have every reason not to." "That is inefficient," Caelthra observed, though her voice lacked conviction. "Yes." Marcus's mouth moved into what her database identified as a slight smile. "But efficiency isn't the same thing as meaning." She left the containment cell carrying more than blood samples, carrying a question that had no space in her research protocols. What did she actually protect when she stripped away everything else? The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Caelthra's visits to the containment cell transitioned from data collection to something that resembled conversation. She would enter with clinical justifications, monitoring recovery metrics, testing cognitive responses, documenting adaptation patterns, but increasingly she would find herself sitting beside Marcus during the rest periods, the medical equipment forgotten, the professional distance eroding with each shared silence. He told her about his work before the war, emergency response coordination, evacuation planning, the specific logistics of moving vulnerable populations away from danger. He spoke about it matter-of-factly, without heroism or self-aggrandizement, as if choosing to protect strangers was simply what a person did. Caelthra listened and found herself sharing details she had never articulated to anyone. The pressure of her research role, the expectation that she would produce results without questioning their application, the way she had learned to compress her discomfort into something manageable, invisible, professionally acceptable. "You're good at compartmentalizing," Marcus observed during one of these conversations. They sat side by side on the floor of his cell, close enough that Caelthra could feel the heat radiating from his body, warming the cooler air her species preferred. "My training emphasizes emotional regulation," she replied. "That's not the same as actually feeling things." He shifted slightly, and his shoulder came to rest against hers. Minimal contact, easily dismissed as accidental, but Caelthra felt hyper-aware of the pressure, the warmth, the simple fact of touch that served no clinical purpose. "Feeling is inefficient," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to herself. Marcus turned his head, bringing his face closer to hers. Efficiency is overrated. Kyle-Thra's respiratory rate increased. Her species did not blush, did not display the visible markers of physiological arousal that humans exhibited, but she felt the internal cascade nonetheless: elevated heart rate, hormonal shifts, the activation of neural pathways associated with pair bonding that her people reserved for carefully negotiated partnerships. "I should collect the cardiovascular readings," she said, not moving. "Should you?" Marcus's voice dropped lower, intimate in a way that made Kyle-Thra's secondary heart skip. "Or are you just following protocols?" The question echoed his earlier challenge, but this time it carried different weight. This time, Kyle-Thra understood he was not asking about her research methodology, but about something far more fundamental: whether she would continue choosing the safety of prescribed behavior over the risk of actual connection. She turned to face him fully, their bodies closer than professional propriety permitted. His hand rested on the floor between them, and Kyle-Thra found herself reaching for it, removing her protective glove so that her skin could make direct contact with his. The warmth shocked through her system, not painful but overwhelming in its immediacy, in the way it bypassed every intellectual defense she had constructed. Marcus's fingers curled gently around hers, his pulse strong against her palm, and Kyle-Thra felt the tectonic shift of her carefully ordered world beginning to crack. "This violates research ethics," she whispered. "Yes," Marcus agreed. "Does that change what you want?" Kyle-Thra looked at their joined hands, at the physical evidence of boundaries crossed, at the simple human gesture that her species would interpret as profound intimacy. She thought about 7 orbital cycles of documenting suffering, about the strategic directorate's demands, about the professional distance that had always protected her from recognizing the humanity of her subjects. "No," she said, and felt the word settle into truth. The changes could not remain invisible forever. Velkorn summoned Kyle-Thra to his office during first shift, when the facility operated at full capacity, and her absence from the research wing would be noted. He waited until she stood before his desk before speaking, his 3 primary eyes fixed on her with the particular intensity that preceded formal reprimands. "Your research metrics have declined," he said, pulling up her official reports on his display. "Subject 7 Alpha shows signs of adaptation rather than deterioration. This is contrary to project objectives." Kyle-Thra maintained her professional composure, secondary arms held precisely against her sides. "Human neurological architecture demonstrates unexpected resilience. I am documenting these patterns. You are deviating from approved protocols." Velkorn gestured to a secondary display showing the containment cell's environmental logs. "Temperature stabilization, increased nutritional allocation, reduced isolation frequency. These modifications were not authorized." The evidence was incontrovertible. Kyle-Thra had known this confrontation would come, had known her small acts of mercy would eventually accumulate into visible patterns. She had continued anyway, choosing connection over concealment. "I implemented experimental variables to test alternative hypotheses," she said, the lie tasting foreign on her translator. "You compromised research integrity." Velkorn stood, his greater height emphasizing the hierarchy between them. "The strategic directorate requires data on human breaking points. Your personal reluctance to generate this data is a professional failure." Kyle-Thra felt something in her thoracic cavity tighten, not fear exactly, but recognition that she had reached the inflection point in her own resilience, the moment where continuing forward meant choosing between 2 incompatible versions of herself. "The human's name is Marcus Chen," she said quietly. "He coordinated civilian evacuations during the Epsilon Corridor conflict. He saved lives while others were ending them." Velkorn's secondary eyes narrowed. "Biographical data is irrelevant to research outcomes." "Is it?" Kyle-Thra stepped closer to his desk, abandoning the submissive posture her training prescribed. "Or have we defined relevance so narrowly that we can no longer recognize what we're actually doing? We are generating strategic intelligence. We are torturing prisoners," Kyle-Thra interrupted, the words emerging with a force she had not known she possessed. "We are documenting suffering and calling it research, and pretending the methodology absolves us of responsibility for the harm." The silence that followed felt absolute. Velkorn stared at her with an expression she could not interpret, his translator clicking softly as it processed her statement. "You are removed from the project," he said finally. "Effective immediately. All access to Subject 7 Alpha is revoked. Report to Administrative Review for professional evaluation." Kylthra felt the pronouncement settle over her like a physical weight. She thought about Marcus sitting alone in his cell, about the small improvements she had made to his conditions, about the warmth of his hand in hers. "What will happen to him?" she asked. "That is no longer your concern." Velkorn gestured toward the exit. "Your clearance is suspended. Leave the facility." Kylthra walked through corridors she had navigated for 7 orbital cycles, past observation decks and containment cells and research stations where colleagues continued their work with the same clinical detachment she had once mastered. She did not look back. In her personal quarters, she sat in darkness, feeling the architecture of her professional identity collapse around her, and understood that Marcus had been right. Strength was what you chose to protect when everything else was stripped away. She just had to decide what she was actually willing to protect. Kylthra spent 3 planetary rotations under administrative review, answering questions about her methodology, her motivations, her fitness for continued research responsibilities. She provided carefully calibrated responses, neither admitting wrongdoing nor demonstrating the remorse her evaluators clearly expected. On the 4th day, they returned her limited clearance and reassigned her to archival work in the data processing wing. The demotion was explicit. She could continue employment at the facility, but she would never conduct active research again. She accepted the assignment and began planning her violation of facility security protocols. The archival wing occupied the facility's lower levels, far from the containment sector, but connected to the same central data network. Kylthra used her access to map the surveillance systems, identify shift rotations, locate the architectural vulnerabilities in what was supposed to be a completely secure installation. Her species excelled at pattern recognition, at finding the subtle inconsistencies in complex systems. She applied this talent to constructing an approach that would allow her to reach Marcus's cell undetected. The plan required precision, required her to move during the narrow window between 3rd shift and 1st shift, when personnel transitions created temporary gaps in monitoring. It required her to override security protocols she had helped design, to betray the institution that had defined her entire professional existence. It required her to choose connection over compliance. On the 8th night of her demotion, Kylthra waited until the facility settled into its deepest quiet, then left her quarters carrying nothing but a data tablet and the specific authorization codes she had extracted from poorly secured administrative files. The corridors leading to the containment sector were empty. The surveillance feeds looped footage from previous shifts, showing nothing but standard environmental patterns. Kylthra moved with the deliberate pace of someone who belonged exactly where she was, and the facility's automated systems did not question her presence. Observation cell, 7's door unsealed at her touch. Kylthra stepped into the space where she had spent so many hours watching, measuring, documenting, where she had learned that clinical distance was just another form of willful blindness. Marcus sat on the floor, looking up as she entered. He did not seem surprised. "Kylthra," he said, her name rough in his mouth but recognizable. "I wondered if you'd come back." She moved to sit beside him, their shoulders touching in that same minimal contact that carried disproportionate meaning. "I was removed from the project. They will assign a new researcher. Will they continue the protocols?" His voice remained steady, but Kylthra heard the tension beneath it. "Yes." She pulled up the data tablet, displaying the files she had accessed during her archival work. "The Strategic Directorate has approved escalation, extended isolation, severe metabolic stress. They want to find your breaking point." Marcus was quiet for several breaths. "And you came to tell me this?" "I came to offer you a choice." Kylthra turned the tablet so he could see the facility schematics, the evacuation routes, the external access points she had identified. "There is a cargo transport that departs in 4 hours. Automated loading, minimal security. If someone were in the correct cargo container, they could leave the facility undetected." Understanding moved across Marcus's face. "You're offering me an escape route." "I am offering you information." Kylthra felt her secondary heart rate accelerate. "What you do with it is your choice." "What happens to you if I use it?" Marcus asked. "They'll know someone helped me. They'll trace it back." Caelthra had considered this extensively, had calculated the probable consequences: professional termination, criminal prosecution, permanent exile from her home world, had understood that choosing to help Marcus escape meant choosing to destroy the carefully constructed life she had spent orbital cycles building. "I am responsible for my choices," she said, "just as you are responsible for yours." Marcus's hand found hers in the dim light, fingers interweaving with a familiarity that felt both new and ancient. "Come with me." The invitation hung in the air between them, impossible and tempting and terrifying. Caelthra thought about the facility's twilight corridors, about the clinical precision of her former work, about the way she had learned to compress discomfort into something manageable. She thought about Marcus's warmth against her skin, about conversations that had nothing to do with research protocols, about the specific quality of his voice when he said her name. "Where would we go?" she asked. "Somewhere they won't look." Marcus's thumb traced patterns on her palm. "Somewhere we can figure out what happens next." Caelthra looked at their joined hands, at the physical impossibility of their connection. Different species, different temperatures, different worlds. At the simple human gesture that meant choosing uncertainty over safety. 4 hours, she said. "We need to move before the shift change." They moved through the facility like shadows, using Caelthra's knowledge of surveillance gaps and Marcus's tactical experience to navigate toward the loading docks. Every corridor felt simultaneously endless and too short, every corner a potential exposure, every automated system a possible alarm. Caelthra had never violated security protocols before, had never chosen deception over compliance. Her hands trembled as she overrode door locks, her secondary heart hammering against her ribs as they slipped past monitoring stations. Marcus stayed close, his warmth a constant presence at her back. When they needed to wait in darkened alcoves for patrols to pass, he would press against her, his breathing steady while hers spiked with anxiety, his calm seeming to transfer through simple proximity. "You're good at this," he whispered during one of these pauses, his mouth close to where her species' auditory sensors clustered. "I'm terrified," Caelthra corrected, though she did not move away from his closeness. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." His hand found hers in the darkness. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means choosing to act despite it. The loading docks occupied the facility's lowest level, vast spaces filled with cargo containers awaiting automated transport. Caelthra led Marcus through the labyrinth of metal boxes, using her tablet to identify which containers were scheduled for the next departure cycle. They found one labeled for delivery to a neutral station in unclaimed space, exactly the kind of destination that wouldn't raise questions or trigger security alerts. Caelthra overrode the manifest controls, creating false inventory records that would explain any anomalous weight readings. Inside, the container smelled of recycled materials and industrial lubricants. Emergency supplies were stored in a locked compartment, standard practice for long-duration cargo flights. Caelthra accessed the compartment, pulling out water rations, nutrient packs, thermal blankets. 6 days, she said, reading the transport duration. "The container will be loaded in 90 minutes. Once it's sealed, there's no way to open it from inside until arrival." Marcus took inventory of the supplies, his movements efficient despite weeks of controlled deprivation. "This will work." Caelthra stood at the container's entrance, looking back at the facility that had defined her existence for 7 orbital cycles. Somewhere in those corridors, her former colleagues continued their research. Somewhere in those cells, other subjects endured their own calibrated suffering. The work would continue with perfect clinical precision, indifferent to her absence. "I should return," she heard herself say. "Create a plausible alibi. Make it harder for them to connect your escape to my assistance." Marcus turned to face her. "Or you could stay." The invitation was simple, but the implications were vast. Abandoning her species' territories, living as a fugitive, choosing exile for the sake of connection. Caelthra's training insisted such choices were irrational, that personal relationships could never justify such comprehensive disruption of professional and social standing. But Caelthra's training had also insisted that suffering could be administered clinically, that distance protected against moral consequence, that following orders absolved responsibility. Her training had been wrong about many things. 6 days in a cargo container, she said, stepping fully into the small space. With limited supplies and no external communication. Yes. Marcus's expression held that same complex awareness, as if he understood exactly what she was choosing and what it cost. With me. Kael'thra felt the weight of the decision settle into her body, not as burden but as commitment, as the terrifying clarity of choosing one impossible thing over another. She had spent 7 orbital cycles documenting the mechanics of collapse, measuring the precise point where resilience gave way to breaking. Now she understood that breaking and failing were not synonymous, that sometimes the strongest choice was the one that looked most like surrender. She closed the container's entrance, sealing them both into darkness. Marcus's hand found hers, and Kael'thra felt his warmth spread through her cooler body, felt the steady rhythm of his breathing sync with her own accelerated pulse. "What happens after we arrive?" she asked. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but we'll figure it out together." The container's walls pressed close around them. Outside, the facility continued its twilight operations, indifferent to the small rebellion happening in its lowest reaches. Kael'thra leaned against Marcus's shoulder, feeling his heat, breathing his strange human scent, and discovered that uncertainty could feel less like loss and more like possibility. The cargo transport launched exactly on schedule, the container lifting with the particular sensation of artificial gravity transitioning to ship-based systems. Kael'thra felt her stomach lurch, felt Marcus's hand tighten around hers in the darkness. 6 days. No light except what leaked through ventilation seams. No space except the narrow confines of the container. No privacy, no escape, no possibility of reconsidering their choice. The first day passed in careful negotiation of physical space, of body heat in close quarters, of the specific logistics of limited resources. They rationed the water and nutrient packs. They took turns sleeping, though sleep proved difficult in the constant hum of ship engines, and the knowledge that discovery would mean consequences neither wanted to contemplate. Kael'thra had spent her career studying beings under stress. Now she experienced it from the inside, the way confinement sharpened awareness, the way proximity intensified every sensation, the way fear and desire became entangled in the body's automatic responses. On the second day, she woke from restless sleep to find herself pressed against Marcus's chest, their bodies curved together in the limited space. His arm rested across her shoulders, his breathing deep and even, his warmth surrounding her like an external circulatory system. She should have moved, should have re-established distance, maintained the boundaries that her training insisted were necessary for psychological stability. Instead, she stayed still, feeling his heartbeat against her back, and understood that sometimes the breaking point wasn't where you failed, but where you stopped trying to hold everything together alone. "You're awake," Marcus murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Yes." "Regrets yet?" Kael'thra considered the question seriously. She thought about her destroyed career, her severed connections to her home world, the criminal charges that certainly awaited if she were ever identified. She thought about the facility's clinical corridors, about the careful documentation of suffering, about the way she had learned to see beings as data points rather than as lives. "No," she said. "No regrets." Marcus's arm tightened slightly around her. "Good." They lay together in the darkness, and Kael'thra found herself speaking truths she had never articulated, confessions that required the safety of invisibility to emerge. She told him about the first subject she had broken, about the sick satisfaction she had felt at her methodological success, about the way she had trained herself not to see the cost, about the growing recognition that her work served cruelty dressed as knowledge. Marcus listened without judgment, his presence steady and accepting. When she finished, he shared his own truths, about the evacuations he had coordinated, about the people he couldn't save, about the guilt that followed him even though logic insisted he had done everything possible. "We all carry things," he said quietly. "The question is whether we let them define us or whether we choose to become something else." Kael'thra turned in his arms, bringing them face to face in the dim light from the ventilation seam. Her species did not kiss. The gesture held no cultural meaning for her people, but she pressed her forehead to his, sharing breath and warmth and the simple fact of closeness. "Show me," she whispered. "Show me what your strength means." Marcus's hand traced the side of her face, his touch gentle in a way that made her respiratory rate spike. It means this: choosing connection, even when it's terrifying. Protecting something fragile because it matters, not because it's easy. He kissed her then, his mouth warm against hers, and Caelthra felt the alien sensation translate directly into her nervous system. Not sexual exactly, but intimate, in a way that bypassed language, that communicated in the fundamental vocabulary of bodies choosing trust. The days blurred together after that. They moved through fear and desire, and the strange alchemy of forced proximity transforming into chosen intimacy. They learned each other's tolerances, each other's needs, the specific ways two impossible bodies could find accommodation in close quarters. On the 6th day, the container settled with the particular stillness that indicated atmospheric landing. They heard external sounds, automated loading systems, the hiss of pressure equalizing, the mechanical operations of a busy cargo station. Marcus held Caelthra close as they waited for the seal to break, for the container to open, for whatever came next to reveal itself. "Ready?" he asked. Caelthra thought about the facility she had left behind, about the research that had defined her existence, about the careful architecture of her former life. She thought about the choice she had made, about the person she was becoming in the small dark space of their shared flight. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. The cargo station occupied a hollowed asteroid in unclaimed space, a place where multiple species coexisted under fragile treaties and mutual economic interest. Caelthra had studied its demographics during her archival work, human sectors adjacent to Velkari zones, neither species claiming formal jurisdiction, both maintaining unofficial influence. Perfect territory for disappearing. They emerged from the container into organized chaos, automated systems shuffling cargo, while various species moved through loading docks on their own business. Caelthra kept her head down, grateful for the station's size, for the way anonymity could be purchased through simple numbers. Marcus guided them through the crowds with the same tactical awareness he had demonstrated in the facility, finding routes that avoided surveillance choke points, selecting a small residential sector in the station's lower levels where questions were discouraged and privacy was the default setting. The quarters they rented were minimal: one room, shared facilities, the kind of space designed for transient populations. But it had a door that locked from the inside, windows that looked out at the asteroid's pocked surface, and the particular silence that came from being surrounded by people who had chosen not to know their neighbors. Caelthra stood at the window while Marcus secured their limited possessions, watching ships arrive and depart, in the void beyond the station's protective shielding. Somewhere in that darkness, the facility continued its operations. Somewhere in that vast space, authorities were possibly searching for a missing prisoner and the researcher who had helped him escape. "We can't stay here permanently," she said. Marcus joined her at the window, his reflection merging with hers in the transparent surface. "No, but we can stay long enough to figure out what comes next." "What does come next?" Caelthra turned to face him, suddenly feeling the weight of their impossible situation. Different species, no legal standing, no resources beyond what they had taken from the container. "I destroyed my career. You're a fugitive. We have no plan. We have each other." Marcus's hand found hers, his warmth grounding against her rising panic. "That's more than most people get." Caelthra wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that connection could somehow compensate for everything they had lost. But she had spent 7 orbital cycles in the precise measurement of consequences, had learned that choices always carried weight that had to be borne. "My species will consider me a traitor," she said quietly. "Yours will see me as the enemy. There is no category for what we are. Then we make one." Marcus pulled her closer, eliminating the space between them. "We figure out how to exist in the gaps between categories, in the places where the maps don't quite match up." He kissed her then, and Caelthra felt the alien warmth of it spread through her system, felt her body respond in ways her training had never prepared her for. Not just desire, though that was present. Something deeper, the recognition that she had chosen this person, this impossible connection, and that the choosing mattered more than all the practical obstacles it created. They moved to the narrow bed, learning each other without urgency, without the confined desperation of the cargo container. Marcus traced the places where her species' physiology differed from his touch gentle but curious, And Kael'thra discovered that vulnerability could feel like strength when offered freely rather than extracted through protocol. She ran her hands over his body, cataloguing the evidence of what he had endured, the weight he had lost, the subtle scars, the specific tension that lived in his muscles. She thought about the clinical measurements she had taken, the way she had documented his suffering with detached precision, and felt the full weight of what she had done before she understood what she was actually doing. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his shoulder, "for what I did to you, for what I was willing to do." Marcus's arms tightened around her. "You stopped. That's what matters. You chose differently." "Is that enough?" Kael'thra asked. "Does choosing differently undo the harm?" "No." Marcus's honesty was absolute. "But it means you don't keep causing it. It means you become someone new." They held each other in the station's artificial night, two bodies that should never have met, should never have connected, finding accommodation in the simple fact of choosing each other over all the practical reasons they should not. The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm. Marcus found work in the station's engineering sectors, his evacuation planning experience translating easily to maintenance logistics. Kael'thra used her research skills to secure employment in a xenobiological database, cataloging information without the clinical detachment her previous work had required. They built a life from fragments, meals shared in their small quarters, conversations that ranged from profound to mundane, the specific intimacy that came from choosing each other repeatedly in the small moments that accumulated into something resembling permanence. But permanence was an illusion. Kael'thra knew this. The station existed in precarious balance, and their presence added another point of potential instability. She was reviewing medical databases during her shift when the alert came through official channels. Facility security had issued formal charges against xenobiologist Kael'thra for prisoner assistance, security violations, and research protocol abandonment. A warrant had been distributed to all Allied stations. Kael'thra sat very still, watching the notification cycle through standard diplomatic language, and understood that their fragile peace was ending. She returned to their quarters to find Marcus waiting, his expression telling her he already knew. "I saw the warrant," he said. "Station security will process it within 48 hours." Kael'thra set down her data tablet, feeling the weight of inevitability settle over her. "We need to leave." "Where?" Marcus asked reasonably. "Every Allied station will have the same warrant. Neutral zones won't stay neutral if your people apply pressure." He was right. Kael'thra's training in pattern analysis showed her the future with uncomfortable clarity. Escalating searches, narrowing options, the inexorable logic of two fugitives with nowhere left to hide. "There are independent colonies," she said, pulling up star charts on her tablet. "Outside formal territorial claims, they might not honor extradition requests." "Might?" Marcus moved to stand beside her, studying the charts. "That's a lot of maybes to bet our lives on." Kael'thra looked at the scattered points of light indicating human settlements, Velkari outposts, the complex tapestry of claimed and unclaimed space. She thought about the facility's twilight corridors, about the clinical precision of her former work, about the careful measurement of breaking points. "We could separate," she heard herself say. "You return to human territories. I claim coercion. Say you forced me to help you escape." They might accept that explanation. Marcus turned to face her fully, his expression difficult to read. "Is that what you want?" "No." The admission came without hesitation. "But wanting is insufficient justification for continued risk." "Insufficient for what?" Marcus's hands came to rest on her shoulders, grounding, warm. "Kael'thra, we left the facility because staying meant continuing to participate in harm. We chose each other because connection mattered more than safety. Those reasons haven't changed. The consequences have escalated," Kael'thra countered, feeling her professional training reassert itself against the chaos of emotion. "I am endangering you by my presence. The logical choice is separation." "Logic?" Marcus's laugh held no humor. "You're the one who told me strength isn't about endurance. It's about what you choose to protect. I'm choosing to protect this, even if it's impractical." Kael'thra felt something crack in her chest, some final defense giving way under the persistent pressure of his commitment. She had spent 7 orbital cycles documenting collapse, had learned to recognize the precise moment when resistance transformed into surrender. This felt different, not breaking but opening, not failing but finally allowing herself to need something beyond clinical certainty. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed. "How to choose without certainty. How to commit without knowing the outcome." Marcus pulled her closer, and Caelthra felt his warmth envelop her, felt his heartbeat steady against her own accelerated rhythm. "Nobody knows the outcome. We just decide what we're willing to risk for what matters." They stood together in their small quarters, looking at star charts that showed nowhere safe, nowhere certain, only scattered possibilities in the vast dark between worlds. "The Proxima settlements," Caelthra said finally, pointing to a cluster of independent colonies. "Human-founded but multi-species, no formal extradition treaties. It's our best option." "Then that's where we go." Marcus's certainty seemed absolute, as if the decision required no second guessing, no calculation of consequences. Caelthra had never trusted certainty before, had never believed that commitment could exist without complete information, without measured risk assessment, without the clinical precision that had defined her entire approach to existence. But she trusted Marcus. Trusted the specific quality of his strength, the way he chose protection over safety, connection over isolation. She kissed him, letting the alien warmth of it spread through her system, and chose to risk everything on the improbable possibility that wanting could be sufficient justification after all. They booked passage on a transport, leaving for the Proxima settlements within 36 hours, using false documentation Marcus acquired through contacts he declined to name. The intervening time passed in careful preparation, liquidating their few possessions, erasing their digital footprints, planning the logistics of disappearing. Caelthra spent her final shift at the xenobiological database, systematically corrupting her access records, creating false trails that would complicate any attempt to track her movements. Professional ethics would have condemned such actions as sabotage. But Caelthra had learned that ethics were more complex than institutional protocols, that sometimes the right choice violated every rule designed to maintain order. She was completing the final corruption protocols when her supervisor approached, a Thresh technician named Velcaris, who had shown unusual kindness during Caelthra's employment. "The security alert about you came through official channels," Velcaris said quietly, his translator rendering his concern in flat synthetic tones. "I am required to report your presence." Caelthra's hands stilled on the keyboard. "Will you?" Velcaris was silent for several seconds. "I have children," he said finally. "Sometimes I think about what I would want someone to do if they were in danger, if the rules meant harm instead of protection. And," Caelthra kept her voice neutral, though her secondary heart hammered against her ribs, "and I think I would want someone to make a mistake." Velcaris turned away, returning to his own workstation. "Perhaps a clerical error that delays official processing for 24 hours. Caelthra felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you." "I did not do anything," Velcaris replied, not looking at her, except perhaps fail to be adequately competent at administrative tasks. She left the database center knowing she would never return, that Velcaris had given her the gift of time at personal risk, that small acts of chosen mercy existed even in systems designed to prevent them. Marcus was waiting at their quarters, their few possessions packed into a single container. He looked up as she entered, reading her expression with the familiarity that came from choosing to truly see another person. "Ready?" he asked. Caelthra thought about the question, about all the layers of preparation it implied. Ready to leave the station where they had built a fragile life, ready to gamble on uncertain welcome in unfamiliar territory, ready to commit to connection without guarantee, to choose each other repeatedly in the face of every practical objection. "Yes," she said, and felt the truth of it settle into her body. They traveled to the transport dock together, moving through the station's crowds with the particular awareness of people who understood they were being watched, that their time was running out. The transport was a civilian vessel, multi-species crew, the kind of ship that asked minimal questions if payments cleared. Caelthra and Marcus found their assigned quarters, small but private, with actual acceleration couches and a sealed door. After the cargo container, after the station's temporary housing, the space felt almost luxurious. As the transport prepared for departure, Caelthra stood at the small viewport, watching the station recede into the darkness. She thought about the facility she had left orbital cycles ago, about the careful documentation of suffering she had performed with such clinical precision. She thought about the choice to help Marcus escape, about the subsequent choices that had led them here. No breaking point, just decisions that accumulated into transformation. Marcus joined her at the viewport, his hand finding hers. Nervous? Terrified, Caelthra admitted. The Proxima settlements might not accept us. We have limited resources, no formal protection. Every choice from here carries risk we cannot fully calculate. True. Marcus's thumb traced patterns on her palm. But we're making those choices together. That has to count for something. Caelthra leaned against his shoulder, feeling his warmth, breathing his strange human scent. Outside the viewport, stars scattered across the darkness in patterns that suggested order, but promised nothing. I spent 7 orbital cycles studying resilience, she said quietly, documenting the precise point where beings broke under controlled stress. I thought I understood strength. And now? Marcus asked. Now I understand it's not about endurance at all. It's about what you choose to protect, who you choose to become. Caelthra turned to face him fully. I choose this, us. Whatever comes next. Marcus kissed her, and Caelthra felt the response cascade through her system. Not just desire, but recognition. Not just attraction, but commitment. The specific sensation of choosing one person above all the logical reasons not to. The transport accelerated, carrying them toward uncertain welcome, toward a future they would have to build from nothing but determination and choice. Caelthra had spent her career measuring collapse. Now she would learn what it meant to build instead. The Proxima settlements were nothing like the facility's clinical precision or the cargo station's anonymous crowds. Built on a marginally habitable moon, the colonies sprawled across the surface in organic patterns that suggested growth rather than planning. Human architecture mixing with Velkari modules and structures from species Caelthra could not immediately identify. The settlement authorities processed their arrival with the particular efficiency of people who had seen countless refugees, fugitives, and displaced persons seeking uncertain sanctuary. Yes, they had heard the extradition warrant. No, they did not honor such requests without substantial evidence of actual criminal harm. Prisoner assistance during an undeclared conflict? The official shrugged, unimpressed. Caelthra and Marcus were assigned temporary housing in the settlement's outer ring given work permits, and essentially left to establish themselves however they could manage. The quarters were smaller than their station apartment, colder, less refined. But the window looked out at actual sky. Thin atmosphere, yes, but genuine planetary surface rather than manufactured void. Caelthra stood at that window during their first night, watching unfamiliar constellations, and felt the vast weight of everything she had left behind. Marcus joined her, his warmth a constant anchor. Regrets? He asked, echoing his question from the cargo container. Caelthra considered carefully. She thought about her destroyed career, her severed connections to her home world, the professional identity she had spent orbital cycles constructing. She thought about the facility's research wing, about colleagues who would remember her as brilliant or as traitor, depending on their perspective. She thought about Marcus's hand in hers, about the specific warmth of his presence, about the way choosing connection had taught her that strength and surrender were not opposites but complementary truths. No, she said, no regrets. They built a life from fragments and determination. Marcus found work coordinating evacuation planning for the settlement's emergency response teams. Caelthra used her research skills in the medical sector, documenting xenobiological responses, but this time focusing on healing rather than breaking points. Weeks became months. They learned the settlement's rhythms, its particular culture of displaced persons and voluntary exiles. They made cautious friendships with neighbors who asked few questions. They established routines, morning meals together, evening walks along the settlement's perimeter, nights spent learning each other's bodies with increasing fluency. 6 months after their arrival, Caelthra received a communication from an unknown source. She opened it in private, her secondary heart accelerating as she recognized the encryption signature, Facility Research Protocols. The message was brief. Velkorn had been removed from his position. The Strategic Directorate had launched an investigation into research ethics violations. Several researchers, confronted with evidence of their methodologies, had requested reassignment. The facility's torture, the message used that word specifically, had become politically untenable. The message did not absolve her, did not suggest her choices had been vindicated, but it confirmed that her departure had created questions, had forced examination of practices that thrived in silence. Caelthra deleted the message and returned to the quarters she shared with Marcus. He was preparing their evening meal, moving through their small kitchen with comfortable familiarity. "You look different," he observed, setting down the utensils. "I received communication from the facility." Caelthra moved to stand beside him. "They are reviewing research ethics, changing protocols." Marcus's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something that looked like relief mixed with sadness. "Because you left, perhaps." Caelthra took his hand, feeling the now familiar warmth. "Or perhaps the system was already unstable, and my departure simply exposed existing fractures." "Does it matter which?" Marcus asked. Caelthra thought about the question, about 7 orbital cycles of clinical precision, about the moment she had chosen connection over compliance, about every subsequent choice that had led them to this small kitchen on a marginal moon in unclaimed space. "No," she said finally. "What matters is that we chose differently, that we continue choosing." She kissed him, the gesture now familiar, the alien sensation integrated into her understanding of intimacy. Outside their window, Proxima's thin atmosphere caught the light of their star, painting the settlement in colors her species had no natural names for. They had no certainty here, no guarantee that their presence would remain tolerated, that their connection could survive the inevitable stresses of building a life in exile. No protection, except what they could offer each other through repeated choice and commitment. But Caelthra had learned that certainty was overrated. That strength was not about enduring until you broke, but about choosing what to protect when everything else was stripped away. She had spent 7 orbital cycles documenting collapse. Now she would spend the rest of her life learning what it meant to build instead. One choice, one moment, one impossibly warm touch at a time. Years later, standing in the same quarters watching the same alien sky, Caelthra would think about the facility's twilight corridors, about the clinical precision of measuring suffering, about the person she had been before she understood that data points were lives. That distance was just another form of cowardice. She would think about Marcus beside her, his warmth unchanged, his presence the constant anchor against which she measured every subsequent choice. And she would understand that she had never actually documented breaking points at all. She had only learned to recognize the moment when transformation became inevitable, when the choice between who you were and who you might become could no longer be avoided. The facility had taught her to measure collapse. Marcus had taught her that sometimes breaking open was the only path to becoming whole.